when we were arranging the talk, I was going to talk about Western anti-supernaturalism and to offer some challenges to that. But that could also be defined as philosophic materialism. The problem is, some people were telling me earlier that they thought I was going to be speaking on like economic materialism. So just to qualify, I'm not actually speaking on economic materialism, but if you really wanted to hear about that, read the Gospel of Luke. Or James or Amos or something like that. Anyway, one objection to the Gospel's reliability, many in Western academic culture doubt that miracle reports could actually come from eyewitnesses, and therefore they dismiss the possibility that these narratives in the Gospels actually are veridical. They actually correspond to what could have happened. Today, however, there are hundreds of millions of people who claim to have seen miracles. Now, nobody would say that all those claims are actually authentic. But one thing you can't get away with saying is that eyewitnesses never claim to have seen things like this, like you have reported in the Gospels, because we have lots of people claiming to have seen those things. Just to start with one example, Lisa Larios had reticulum cell sarcoma of the right pelvic bone. She had cancer of the hip. She was dying of it. It had already metastasized. Her parents hadn't told her that she was dying. But a neighbor persuaded her mom to take her to a healing meeting, even though her mom was kind of reluctant because her daughter didn't even know how sick she really was. She just knew that she couldn't get out of her wheelchair. So she took her to this meeting, and whatever you think of healing meetings, it doesn't really matter because nobody actually had the chance to lay hands on her or pray for her. But while she was at that meeting and other people were being prayed for, she suddenly felt her hip like being healed, and Lisa Larios jumped out of her wheelchair and started running around. Now, sometimes under certain conditions, you can say that could be due to adrenaline, but she didn't end up returning to her wheelchair. In fact, she shocked her father when she walked in pushing the wheelchair home afterwards. Testing afterwards showed not only that Lisa's cancer was gone, but that where her cancer had eaten away her bones, the bones had been healed. That's not something that happens on its own, especially not instantly. So mostly I write commentaries, but because the issue of, 1/3 of Mark's gospel consists of miracle stories. So because I need to deal with that, because it's in the text, I was going to have a footnote in my Acts commentary saying that, well, miracles, some people say this couldn't ultimately go back to eyewitness accounts because eyewitnesses would never claim this. That's simply not true. I was just going to give a footnote saying there are plenty of places that do claim it's true. And in the footnote, I was simply going to give, cite a few books that would give documentation for that. But it took me a long time before I found those books. So in the meantime, I was collecting more and more documentation. The footnote grew and grew, and after it was about 200 pages, I decided it needed to be a separate book, which turned out to be 1,100 pages, which happily came out when it did, otherwise it would still be getting longer. But miracle and exorcism accounts constitute over half of Mark's narrative before the Passion. They constitute roughly 1/5 of the book of Acts, and they're a common reason for skeptics doubting the historical validity of these works. And it's not just Mark. It's emphatic in Mark, but we have them recorded in every layer of early Christian tradition. You have it in what scholars usually call Q. Not all scholars believe in Q, but for those of us who do, where Matthew and Luke overlap, besides where they're following Mark. Also, special material in Matthew and Luke that's not in the other one. John reports them. Paul doesn't report them as often when he's talking to local congregations. He does talk about gifts of the Spirit, like gifts of healings and so on, and miracles. And of course, James talks about healing as well. But when Paul talks about signs and wonders, he especially talks about it when he's describing his work of breaking new ground in evangelism. So he talks about it in Romans 15:19, about it happening virtually everywhere he was going and breaking new ground for the kingdom. He talks about it in 2 Corinthians 12:12, where he actually says to the Corinthians, you yourselves are witnesses of the signs and wonders that were done among you. And then you have it in the rabbis noted that Jesus was known for this, although they attributed it to magic. Celsus, who was a Gentile critic of Christianity, also attributed it to magic, but nobody tried to deny that Jesus had done these things. And you have the church fathers reporting continuing miracles. The historical modern Western reason for denying miracles is that those who deny them deny any credible eyewitnesses for miracles. And a couple famous deniers in my discipline of New Testament include David Friedrich Strauss in the 1800s and Rudolf Bultmann writing in the 1900s. Strauss said that the gospel miracle stories are legends. Now, his argument was more plausible than some of his predecessors who didn't believe in actual miracles, but they believed, they came up with other explanations. So, for example, how could Jesus walk on water in the Lake of Galilee? Well, he knew where all the rocks were. That's kind of, So Strauss said, no, these are just myths. These are legends that arose over a period of generations. Now, Strauss, though, should have actually known better that that's not the only way that you can get miracle stories. Because Strauss had a friend by the name of Edward Morica who had a diagnosed spinal problem. And Morica could barely walk, but after he spent some time with the German Lutheran pastor, Johann Christoph Blumhardt, who was known for his ministry of healing and exorcism in the Black Forest region of Germany in the 1800s, Morica was hiking in the mountains. And Strauss said, oh no, now Morica is going to think miracles actually happen. He didn't, he decided that his diagnosed spinal problem must have just been psychosomatic. But one thing that Strauss didn't do was claim that his friend's healing was simply a legend that arose over a few generations of time. Bultmann thought that all these stories, even about Blumhardt, were legends, because Bultmann's writing later than Blumhardt. But today we have Blumhardt's diaries, we have letters from witnesses and so forth that actually document firsthand that these are not legends, that this goes back to the original sources. Bultmann said that mature modern people don't believe in miracles. But by the way, he said that. Barth, on the other hand, I'm speaking of Karl Barth, not Bart Ehrman. Well, only a few of you got it. But anyway, Karl Barth referred to Blumhardt as one of his mentors. So he and Bultmann and that line of theologians actually believe that these things happened with Blumhardt. But Bultmann said, mature modern people don't believe in miracles. It's impossible to use the telegraph machine and believe in the New Testament world of spirits and miracles. That's why we don't use telegraph machines anymore. But he also said the electric light. And he dismissed stories of Blumhardt as legends. Bultmann says the modern world denies miracles. And I had a professor, he was our school's last remaining Bultmannian, and he was insistent on this point. And I pointed out that Bultmann's limitation of the modern world to his mid-20th century Western academic elite excluded from the modern world 2/3 of the doctoral students sitting around the table, and actually excluded from the world all traditional Jews, Christians, Muslims, traditional tribal religionists, spiritists, basically everybody but a really small slice of the modern world. Justo Gonzalez, citing Latino churches, declares that what Bultmann declares to be impossible is not just possible, but even frequent. Hua Yung, retired Methodist bishop of Malaysia, says that Bultmann's philosophic problem is an exclusively Western one. Most of the deniers, Bultmann and Strauss and others, ultimately depended on arguments set forth by David Hume. Now, David Hume was actually condensing arguments by deists, the more radical deists. But Hume said that there's no genuinely credible eyewitnesses for miracles, and therefore anybody who claims to be an eyewitness doesn't really count, because we know miracles, there's no reason to believe in miracles because we have no genuinely credible eyewitnesses for them. So if anybody claims to be an eyewitness, well, they're excluded because we have no reason to believe in miracles. It's an entirely circular argument. Now, I'm really super simplifying his arguments here for the sake of time. But he said that miracles violate natural law. But his understanding of miracles as violations of natural law differ from what how any theist ever defined miracles. I mean, Exodus 14 says that God sent a strong east wind to blow back the sea. How is that a violation of nature? Or rather, it's a use of nature. Further, his prescriptive view of natural law differs from today's conceptions of natural law, and it also differed from conceptions in his own day, in that Newton and the early Newtonians believed in miracles because they believed that the miracles were, God as the lawgiver had the authority over the laws. He wasn't bound by them. Well, his second argument, which is kind of the basis for his first argument, is that experience shows no miracles. Uniform human experience leads us to never expect that anything is really a miracle. So if you've got well-supported claims for miracles, they have to be rejected. Now, how many of you have heard of Hume? Of course you've heard of him. I just mentioned him, right? So, no, but I shouldn't really pick on him now that he's dead. This is a posthumous critique. It was intended, as a little bit of humor. But anyway, how many of you have heard of Blaise Pascal? Yeah. If you hadn't heard of Pascal, he's kind of often considered the father of the modern computer. How many of you have heard of computers? Well, Pascal was a man of faith. His niece had a running eyesore that emitted a foul odor. Seems to have been clearly organic. People around, they could smell it. She'd had it for some time. But she was at a Jansenist monastery when she was touched with the holy thorn from Jesus' crown of thorns. Now, personally, I don't think it was really a thorn from Jesus' crown of thorns. I think Luther was probably right when he said that there were enough nails left over from the Holy Cross to shoe every horse in Saxony. But, relics were very popular at this time. But it was a contact point for her faith. And when she was touched with this holy thorn, supposedly from Jesus' crown of thorns, she was instantly and publicly healed in the sight of many witnesses. And the Queen Mother of France sent her own physician to check it out, so this was well verified. And Hume points to this. He says, look, this is better verified than any miracle that we have in the Bible, for example. I mean, it's medically documented, it's clearly organic, and so on. But we know this didn't happen, so why would we believe anything else? And then he moves on from there. That's his whole argument. Why? Because he could get away with that because nobody liked Jansenists. They were too Augustinian for the French Jesuits, and they were too Catholic for the English and Scottish Protestants. There have been a number of major philosophic challenges to Hume published by Cambridge and Oxford and Cornell and elsewhere. The one published by Oxford was by someone, he titled his book Hume's Abject Failure, his argument regarding miracles. Someone criticized that book and said, you just hold this view because you're a Christian. That's why you don't like his argument about miracles. To which the author responded, actually, I'm not a Christian. I just thought it was a bad philosophic argument. Are there some credible eyewitnesses for miracles today? If we start with churches known for that emphasis, there have been major academic studies on global Pentecostal and charismatic healing, including published by Oxford and so on. There was a 2006 Pew Forum survey done of Pentecostals and charismatics in just 10 countries. And in those 10 countries alone, given the percentages and the extrapolations from that, those 10 countries alone, for the Pentecostals and Protestant charismatics in those countries alone, the estimated total of these people who claim to have witnessed divine healing comes out to somewhere around 200 million people. More surprisingly, those Christians who didn't claim to be Pentecostal or Protestant charismatics, somewhere around 39% of them claim to have witnessed or experienced divine healing. So we're talking about hundreds of millions of people. If we look globally, hundreds of millions of people, even in the US, and this is not just limited to Christians who claim divine healing, but it's more in some circles than in some others. The point is not what proportion of these claims involve genuinely divine activity or miracles. The point is whether Hume can start from the premise that you have no credible eyewitnesses for miracles when you've got hundreds of millions of people claiming them. Of course, Hume didn't know that, and I think if Hume were around today, he wouldn't have made his argument. But most people today who start from the premise, well, we know miracles don't happen, that's been proved a long time ago, are simply parroting the conclusions of Hume's argument without re-examining it. So we need to examine claims for miracles. Again, not every claim is authentic, but we need to examine the claims rather than simply dismissing them. Moreover, millions of non-Christians have been convinced. So these are people not starting with a Christian bias, but these are people who often abandoned centuries of traditions and sometimes at great social cost, to become Christians. In fact, was a Christian from North India who apprised me of that reality in terms of what the social cost was for people abandoning their traditions to follow Jesus because they had experienced or witnessed divine healing, or somebody close to them had. And some suggest that somewhere around 70% of global Christian growth in the last few decades has been due to this. Obviously, it's happening more in some places than in others, but especially in areas of groundbreaking evangelism. Now, from China, this was not in the above survey, and it's really hard to quantify because you can't just go around surveying in exactly the same way you can in some other places. But one source from within the China Christian Council, which is affiliated with the Three Self Church, around the year 2000, estimated that somewhere around half of all conversions to Christianity in the previous 20 years have been due to what they termed faith healing experiences. One estimate from within the house church movement estimates closer, at least in rural areas, closer to 90%. Now, again, there's no way to quantify exactly what percentage, but we're probably talking, even in China alone, of millions of people who became believers because they or somebody close to them experienced something out of the ordinary, different from what was like just somebody getting better on their own normally, or from earlier traditions. Dr. Balkrishna Sharma shared with me that 80% of converts in Nepal are due to healings and exorcisms. Now this one I find astonishing, but anyway, this was in a survey that was done in 1981. I don't know how the survey was done, but they said that 10% of non-Christians in Chennai claimed to have experienced healing when somebody prayed for them in the name of Jesus. And these were the ones who didn't become Christians, but still had that experience. Just to give an example, Pastor Israel, who was a Doctor of Ministry student at a Baptist seminary at which I taught in Philadelphia some years ago, he shared with me that through prayer for the sick, his Baptist church grew from a handful to about 600, all of them from non-Christian backgrounds. And there were others who were healed who didn't become members, but a lot of people became members. And this came up because in the very room where this picture was taken, I came in one night with a splitting headache, and he said, "Oh, brother, let me pray for you." And he prayed for me, and nothing happened. And I mean, it has gone away since then. But he said, I said, "Oh, it's because I don't have any faith." He said, "No, brother, it doesn't work here. But everybody I pray for in India," he says, "gets healed. If you come to India and pray for them, they'll get healed." I don't know about that. But he said that this was the precious people he was ministering to. They needed something special. They needed something extravagant. God reaching out to them in a lavish way. Not that we don't get expressions of God's love, but medical technology is a gift from God. We have a lot of other gifts from God, and we have the gospel more freely available. But he said, there almost everybody he prays for gets healed. Ebbi Paran Barrage, who was my Master of Divinity student at Asbury and is now a doctoral student at TEDS near Chicago, he shared with me the story of a place where he went to minister. He was a co-worker with somebody named Bari Malto. And Bari Malto had originally been a shaman, but he contracted leprosy and he was cast out of his village. Well, a couple ladies came and prayed for him in the name of Jesus. And that night he had a dream in which an angel touched his hands. And he found out that when he woke up in the morning, he was completely healed of leprosy. He went into the village. The entire village became Christian. By the time my student got there to work with Bari Malto, half the region had been converted to Christianity. So this one is from Douglas Norwood. He was then a Moravian pastor, and he was visiting Nickerie, Suriname. If you know about the history of the Moravians, they had these long prayer meetings at the beginning. So he got together, the Christians there, they were divided among themselves. Suriname has a lot of Christians, but this particular people group in Suriname was predominantly Hindu, and there'd never been a real breakthrough for the gospel there. There were just a few hundred Christians. They were divided among different churches, and they did something that, of course, we would never do in the rest of our cultures. The Christians were actually competing with each other for the same Christian members. So he got them together for a prayer meeting. God's Spirit fell. They began to repent of their rivalries and weep together and resolved to do actual outreach. And they began sharing the gospel, bringing people to the meeting that would be held that night. And their Hindu neighbors would come and, wow, the Christians never acted like this before. Let's see what's going on. So they came to the church where Doug was going to be preaching, and this one guy was sat on a mat in the front. Doug thinks he was like maybe in his 80s. He may have been younger than that, but the guy had been paralyzed on one side of his body all his life. And so Doug is getting ready to preach, and the guy starts shouting, "Look, I don't believe in your God. I don't believe in my gods. If there were any gods, they would do something for me. They've never done anything for me." And while he's complaining about God, suddenly his right hand, which was paralyzed, shot up in the air. And he looked at it, and he was converted. And the people around looked at it, and they were converted. And that was the beginning of a people movement in Nickerie, Suriname, that over the next few years in the 1990s brought tens of thousands of people to Christ. But this is not just a new thing. This has often happened in times of groundbreaking evangelism. Many of the church fathers claimed to be eyewitnesses of healings and exorcisms that were converting many polytheists. Ramsay MacMullen, and he actually sounded very unhappy about this, but Ramsay MacMullen, a historian at Yale who deals with that period in history, complained that in the 300s, the main cause of conversion to Christianity was not the intellectual apologists. Now, I like intellectual apologists, but that was not the main cause of conversion to Christianity. The main cause of conversion to Christianity was healing and exorcism. So in theological circles where we respect the church fathers for articulating the Trinity and so on, but then they talk about, well, I saw somebody get healed, and we say, the church fathers, they were superstitious. Something not consistent sometimes with our ways of thinking. Shouldn't be skipping all the rest of history. Let me just mention Augustine before I go on. How many of you have heard of Augustine? Augustine, he had this intractable toothache, which to us may not sound like a big thing, probably because we have dentists, right? But he probably needed a root canal or something. But during prayer, he was healed. Augustine had believed that God had stopped doing those things for the most part. But what turned him around, he had a friend named Innocent who had anal fistulas. And the first surgery hadn't gotten them all. And so he was scheduled for a second surgery. Back then, there was no anesthesia. People sometimes bled to death during surgery. And the doctors had all given the same opinion that he needed surgery again. And Innocent was crying out to God and wailing, God, please heal me. Please don't let me go through this. And Augustine was like, stop wailing. I can't concentrate on my prayers. But he was trying to pray with the guy. The next day, they went in to the surgery. They removed the bandages, getting ready to do the surgery, and everything was gone. And so that changed Augustine's way of thinking. And over the next couple of years, and this is in City of God 22:8, over the next couple of years, his diocese alone collected 70 affidavits of accounts of healings, including healings of blindness and raisings from the dead. So, you don't see it if you choose not to see it. He hadn't seen it, but once he was open to it, started seeing the things he hadn't paid attention to before. Now, I need to, before I go on, I need to make some caveats. First of all, I'm not limiting divine action to dramatic miracles. If God answers our prayer through medical means, we thank God for that. It's still God's blessing, just like the parting of the sea. God may have done it through a strong east wind, but it happened in a very timely way. From a theistic perspective, natural or medical healing are also God's gifts. You can't get much more miraculous, I think, than the information content in DNA. But the focus here is on extraordinary healings or other kinds of miracles. Or the way Augustine defined them, these were things that got people's attention. They brought awe of God, because people get used to the other things that happen, what we call naturally. Dramatic miracles today most often appear in the same settings that you have in the Bible, like groundbreaking evangelism, which we increasingly may need in the West as well. But God may answer prayer anywhere, but special signs that really get people's attention most often are reported during evangelism in largely unevangelized regions. Those signs, by the way, if you look at Acts and the Gospels, those signs get people's attention. They don't convert people. So it's the gospel that converts people. The signs get people's attention, which can either mean they become more open to the gospel or they persecute you more. So it's not always a favorable response. And I have this in here somewhere, but I think I'm almost sure I saw it in the slides when I was going over this beforehand. But just add it right now and then talk about maybe more later. But I'm also not claiming that everybody who's prayed for gets healed, as I think most of us know from experience. But anyway, that's not a reason to say, just because it doesn't always happen is not a reason to say it never happens. And to say that sometimes it gets faked is also not a reason to say it never happens, any more than counterfeit bills are a reason to quit using money. But here are some samples. Millions of people claim healing. Are all these things significant? So I interviewed lots of people to see, when they talk about having witnessed divine healing, what they mean by that. Eyewitness testimony is a form of evidence in sociology, anthropology, law, journalism, and of course historiography, which is quite relevant to the New Testament. And sometimes, besides the eyewitness testimony, we have medical records. But one principle that I'm following is that a smaller number of witnesses counts more heavily than a larger number of non-witnesses. And this is a principle that we would normally follow with other kinds of evidence. For example, if there's an accident and the police officer is interviewing witnesses and somebody says, "No, that's not what happened. I know that's not what happened." And the officer says, "Well, can you tell me what you saw happen?" And the person says, "Well, I didn't see anything happen. I wasn't there. That's why I know nothing happened." We wouldn't normally take that seriously. The person who was there counts more. So there are a lot of times today, though, people, when it comes to miracles, well, I didn't see it, so I'm not going to believe it. Credible eyewitness testimony is itself evidence that should be taken into account. It needs to be credible. Oh, here's that slide I was talking about. I'm not claiming that everyone who's prayed for gets healed. You can see I have male pattern balding. I need to wear glasses. And my students often remark that there's something else wrong with my head. But on a more serious note, my wife and I have had miscarriages and so on, despite prayer. So the point is not that miracles are a panacea for all the world's problems. In the Christian understanding, miracles are just samples, reminders of the future promise of the world made new. They point us, though, to what God cares most about: people, their health, feeding them, like Jesus fed the multitudes, their protection, like when Jesus stills a storm, caring for people. And when we work through science and medicine to improve health care for people, or a couple of you here are from Tear Fund, when you're working to improve justice for people, these are things that Jesus cares about. These are things all the way through the Gospels. So having started with those comments, just going on to some other examples from eyewitnesses. Wansuk and Julie Ma, both of them are professors, both of them have PhDs. At the time that I met with them, Wansuk was the director for Oxford Center for Mission Studies. I was giving a lecture about miracles at Oxford at the time and just walked down the street and visited with them. But they gave me a number of accounts, but one of the accounts was of a large toxic goiter that instantly disappeared in the sight of many witnesses when they prayed. My brother Chris was there with me when we witnessed something. This was a few decades ago, and I didn't know what to do with it then. I was a recent convert from atheism and still had some of my skepticism left over, not in God at this point, but I wasn't expecting God to actually do physical things in the world. I was helping with a nursing home Bible study when every week there was this woman named Barbara, and she said, "I wish I could walk, I wish I could walk." She was always coming in her wheelchair. And one week the Bible study leader, who was a seminarian, and this is not, don't use this as an example for what seminarians should do. If the Lord had not been leading him, this would have been disastrous. But anyway, the Bible study leader, then doing his degree at Fuller Seminary, walked over to her, said, "I'm tired of this," grabbed her by the hand, said, "In the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and walk, and lifted her by the hand from her wheelchair. And if faith is a bias, I cannot be accused of it in this case, because I knew she was going to fall flat on the ground. And from the expression on her face, it was pretty clear she knew she was going to fall flat on the ground too. So if this was psychosomatic, it wasn't her psycho. He walked her around the room, and the expression on her face was, I mean, she was absolutely stunned. She couldn't believe what was happening. But from then on, Barbara would walk to the Bible study. And from then on, she would just say, I love my Bible study, I love my Bible study. Barbara, this is a different Barbara. Barbara Cummiskey Snyder. Doctors sent her home to die. She had an advanced case of multiple sclerosis. She'd been declining physically after 15 years. At this point, she couldn't breathe without a machine. Her diaphragm didn't work on its own. Also, she was blind. As she describes it, she was curled up like a pretzel. Her hands were so curled up that every few months they would uncurl them just to get the dead skin out. But she'd been sent home from the hospital one last time. They said she won't be coming back here again. A number of people were praying for her, and she heard a voice, "My child, rise up and walk." And she wasn't capable of moving. I mean, her muscles didn't work. But she jumped out of the bed, which she shouldn't have been able to do. And the first thing she noticed was that her feet were flat on the ground. Second thing she noticed was her hands weren't curled up. The third thing she noticed was she was seeing these things with her eyes. And she was completely healed. I talked with both of her doctors from the time, and both of them confirmed to me, this is a miracle. There's no other explanation for this except that God did this. It made local news. And that was not a temporary remission. Thank God for remissions. But this was 1981. There's been no recurrence of it. Paul Mokake, who was a doctoral student at the seminary where I used to teach, he went back to Cameroon, where he's from, Cameroonian Baptist. And one of our Master of Divinity students, Yolanda, went and visited him and saw blind eyes opened when he prayed. So I asked him about it because I wanted to get independent confirmation. And he said, oh yeah, but he hadn't told me about it because he had lots of stories. So this one is from Greg Spencer. This happened in the US. In this case, we do have medical documentation. He was legally blind. I don't know what the privacy laws are here, but because of what they are in the US, I blotted out the names, but I have them in the original. He was 2,400 in one eye, 2,200 in the other. He was legally blind. He'd already undergone training for the blind. And he went to a retreat for the healing of the mind. He wasn't praying even for the healing of his sight, he was praying for the healing of his mind. But when he opened his eyes, he had not only experienced the healing of his mind, but his eyesight was restored. And the other people who were with him on the retreat have told us that he spent the rest of the retreat just going around looking at everything, enjoying that he could see it all, reading license plates. Look, I can see what that one says. And the doctors confirmed that he had received a remarkable return of his visual acuity. And the reason we have the medical documentation is because the Social Security Administration, which was covering him for disability, said this was macular degeneration. Macular degeneration does not undegenerate. Therefore, we're investigating you for fraud. They investigated him for a year. And finally, at the end of the year, they said, well, you are no longer disabled. And there's always a downside for everything. You're no longer qualified for disability. You have to find a job now. This happened one time in the UK too, where somebody was miraculously healed and they were on permanent disability. And so they applied to get off disability And they said, we're sorry, our computer doesn't have any category for that. You're supposed to be on that permanently. So one of the newspapers that was talking about government waste, did an article on that. Flint McLaughlin, director of Transforming Business Institute at Cambridge University. In 2004, he prayed for a blind man in northern India with clouded eyes. I assume the man had cataracts. And I learned this from Flint, but he also put me in touch with some of the other witnesses who confirmed this and sent me the pictures. This is the field where the man ran in circles praising God. And he was giving his testimony that night. I think this was an orphanage. He was giving his testimony that night, and he began to weep. And they said, why are you weeping? He said, because I've always heard the sound of children, but I'd never seen their faces. This one is from Dr. Rex Gardner in his book, Healing Miracles. He also wrote an article that included some of the testimonies in the book are in this article he wrote for the British Medical Journal back in the 1980s. But this one is of a 9-year-old girl. She was deaf without her hearing aid. She's just been tested. It was due to auditory nerve damage, which again doesn't normally undamage itself. She was praying. She was instantly healed. And they called the audiologist, and the audiologist said, that is impossible. That was auditory nerve damage. It doesn't go away. But they were able to secure another, at least in the US today, you couldn't get another, your insurance wouldn't cover it for sure for you to go back to the audiologist again because you've just been tested. But anyway, they were able to take her back. And his answer is, I have no explanation for this, but she's completely and totally healed. But people say, you never have limbs growing back. Well, that's not really as relevant to the Bible because you don't really have limbs growing back in the Bible either. But you do have some things changing visibly, like the man with the withered hand growing out. So there are some things like this. Bruce Van Natta was working under a semi-truck when the axle broke, and he was crushed under the back of the truck. It crushed his abdomen, and in particular his small abdomen was destroyed. Small intestine was destroyed. You actually need a small intestine. After several surgeries to remove the damaged parts, there were just 116 centimeters left. And one part of it, he had just 25 centimeters of a part of the small intestine that normally was 350 centimeters. He was slowly starving to death. But a friend of his felt led to fly from New York to Wisconsin and pray for him in person. And the guy felt led. He commanded the small intestine to grow in Jesus' name. Bruce felt something like an electric jolt through his body. After that, he was able to eat. And the doctors examined him. The radiologist said that the small intestine was now long enough to be functional. Unless you cut him open and unroll the small intestine, you can't actually measure it. So that's probably not a good idea since it's working. But it seemed from what the radiologist's estimate was that it had now grown to about 2.4 times the length of what it was when it was damaged and removed. Now, the small intestine in an adult can widen, but it can't naturally grow longer. So here we have something that grew back, and we have medical corroboration for it. Eyewitnesses, some of whom I know, report the healings of deaf non-Christians in Jesus' name in Mozambique, leading to massive church growth. Not all of this is not all the people being prayed for by Heidi and Roland, but Heidi and Roland are better known, and they're helping lead this movement, and they care for something like 10,000 orphans. Well, I know them, and I also know other people who have gone there and have witnessed it. They invited me to come, but New Zealand is a long flight, and anyway, I've had too many long flights lately, so eventually I'll probably get there. But it's now been documented with some medical tests that were published in Southern Medical Journal in September of 2010 that documented that people had gone from blindness to sight and from deafness to hearing when they were prayed for in Jesus' name. tested immediately before and immediately after the prayers. Now, as you can well imagine, there were plenty of critics of this on the internet who pointed out, rightly, that testing conditions in rural Mozambique are less than ideal. But Professor Candy Gunther Brown, who's one of the authors of the study, answers the critics in an article that she wrote, in a chapter that she wrote in her book, Testing Prayer, published by Harvard University Press in 2012. And if you can read that chapter and not believe that people actually went from blindness to seeing and from deafness to hearing, you are a very hard skeptic. Brandon Walker, who has a PhD in New Testament, he did spend some time there, and he saw people who were unable to walk being instantly healed and walking away. He saw non-believers healed of blindness and then converted, and deafness and so on. Wendy Dykeman and Henderson Park, who are professors at United Theological Seminary. She's a church history professor. She was president of the seminary, and he's a professor of constructive theology there. They report, and again, these are friends of mine, they report that they witnessed blindness healed in Mozambique. And what would happen is, the blindness is healed, and the next day a church is started in a village that had never had a church before, as people respond to seeing what God is doing. Are healings ever caught on video? One place where I spoke early in my research said, well, you never have healings captured on video, so, well, I didn't really know what to respond because I hadn't seen any videos where it happened, but you can Google it and see all sorts of videos. Probably half of them are doctored, you never know. But anyway, this one definitely wasn't doctored because I was able to interview a lot of the people who knew this person beforehand. Delia Knox was originally from Buffalo, New York. She was injured in an automobile accident. For 22 years, she was paralyzed from the neck down. This is public knowledge. There's all sorts of videos of her, not doctored, but when she was younger, singing from her wheelchair. She was a gospel singer. She did it from a wheelchair. And lots of people I knew lots of people I've interviewed who were from her hometown. Yeah, she definitely was unable to walk. She didn't like going to revival services because when she would go there, or healing meetings, people would grab her by the hand and say, rise up and walk, you're healed! And she wasn't. And you can see why she wouldn't like going to those anymore. But somebody had also prophesied to her that someday you're going to be, and it's actually going to be while you're ministering to somebody else. Well, she was at this one meeting with her husband, and she was kind of disgusted. She was wheeling herself out. I guess it couldn't have been, no, it wasn't from her neck down. It was because she could still use her arms, but her legs were paralyzed. So she was wheeling herself out, and somebody asked her to pray for her baby. So she prayed for the baby, and all of a sudden she started feeling something in her legs that she hadn't had feeling in her legs for 22 years. So she said, hurry, wheel me to the front. So at that point they prayed for her. And you see the video of when this happened in this meeting, and people are holding her up on either side, and she's moving her legs like this. And so the critics on the internet, if you read the comments section, which you probably normally shouldn't do, but the critics were saying, you call that walking? Well, she hadn't walked for 22 years. I mean, she's got atrophied muscles. The account I gave earlier of Barbara Cummiskey Snyder, who was instantly healed and began running around, that was an exception, where God even made it so her muscles weren't atrophied anymore. But in this case, Delia Knox has atrophied muscles. If she had been able to walk perfectly, then people would have said it was fake, right? So, but they're holding her up, and she's moving her legs from the hips, which she hadn't been able to do for 22 years. But there's another video of her coming into a church about a month or two later, and she's walking in under her own power, praying for people. And the best explanation I found from skeptics for this, because you can always come up with an explanation. The best explanation I found from a skeptic for this is that she must have faked her paralysis for 22 years. Somebody said, but you never have anybody raised from death. Nice you mentioned that. Psychosomatic recoveries are better than non-recoveries, but usually people are not considered merely psychosomatically dead. And if these are coincidences, we have a coincidental cluster of coincidences in that 10 people in my immediate circle claim to have witnessed or experienced this. Mine or my wife's immediate circle. It's multiply attested in early sources about Jesus. It's in Q, it's in Mark, Luke, John. Quadratus, writing in the early 2nd century, declares that some of those that Jesus raised from the dead were still alive into his own time. Of course, we have raisings in Acts, one of them in the Eyewitness We material. Around the year 99, a person who became a bishop in Mesopotamia was converted through witnessing a raising. Irenaeus, in the late 2nd century, mentions a church where it was common for people to be raised from the dead, a church in France. Augustine, I already mentioned this, but mentions that among the, now I'm skipping again. There are reports between Augustine and Wesley, but I'm skipping a lot for the sake of time. December 15th, 1742, Mr. Myrick fell sick, and 10 days later, he died. As far as anybody could tell, I mean, they didn't have, couldn't hook something up and see if he had brain activity or whatever, but Wesley and the others prayed, and he started acting alive again. I found scores of modern testimonies. I'm just giving some samples here. Dr. Chauncey Crandall, a cardiologist in West Palm Beach, was making his rounds one Saturday in the hospital when he was called to the emergency room where they'd been trying for 40 minutes to restart the heart of Jeff Markin, who had died. He'd been flatlined for what I understand most or all of this time. So Crandall looked over the evidence and signed the death certificate, was going back to his rounds when, as he was passing through the double doors, he suddenly felt led by God's Spirit to go back and pray for the man. So he goes back in there, the nurse is sponging down the body for the burial. And Crandall, one of his colleagues came in with him. He laid hands on Jeff Markin's head and said, God, if you want this man to have a second chance to know you, I pray that you'll raise him from the dead. Of course, the nurse is looking at him, glaring at him like, Dr. Crandall, you have lost your mind. He told me that, anyway. So he turned to his colleague, said, shock him with the paddle one more time. And his colleague was like, we all agreed he was dead, but look, if you want, shocks him with the paddle one more time. Immediately, Jeff Markin has a normal heartbeat, which after being flatlined, 6 minutes with no oxygen, you have irreparable brain damage. So the nurse started screaming, Dr. Crandall told me, Dr. Crandall, what have you done? Like Frankenstein's monster or whatever. But 2 days later, he went in to see Jeff Markin in the hospital. Now, Jeff Markin had been not just dead, but very visibly dead. He was white, but his extremities had started turning black from cyanosis. So he had been dead for a while. But when he prayed for him, Jeff Markin came back to life. He visited him in the hospital, and Jeff Markin had his second chance to know the Lord. And here is Dr. Crandall participating in Jeff Markin's baptism. Dr. Sean George, from this part of the world, consultant physician in Kalgoorlie, Australia. He was having and actually you can see he has the medical documentation online, but he was having a heart attack, and he was at an outpatient clinic, but they were trying to revive him. His friends worked for 55 minutes, 4,000 chest compressions, 13 shocks. He was dead for an hour and 25 minutes by the time his wife, Sherry Jacob, got there to pray for him. Well, she was supposed to say her goodbyes to him, but she prayed for him. He immediately, his heart started up again. One of his colleagues thought, oh no, this is the worst thing that could happen, because he's got irreparable brain damage. Sooner or later, she's going to have to decide when to disconnect him. But 3 days later, he awoke with no brain damage. He's back to work. He still has the defibrillator logs to prove it. I'm going to skip some of these for the sake of time. But I have some reports from some colleagues that I know. I do need to backtrack and say something about Dr. Crandall, though. For him to have faith to pray for Jeff Markin to be raised from the dead, especially in front of this particular nurse, a year or two before that, his own son Chad had died of leukemia, and he had prayed for Chad to be raised. And of course, he'd been praying all along that he'd be healed, and it didn't happen. And he decided, God, I'm going to trust you no matter what. So there's often the backstory to the faith of people that puts things in context. Lots of reports from India. Again, I'm going to skip some of them. I'll tell you this one just because I have the pictures to go with it. But there was a boy, Vikram, that they... Oh, and by the way, Sean George's colleagues, most of them are Hindus and Muslims at his hospital, and they also acknowledged that it was a miracle. Believers found a boy named Vikram lying at the bottom of a pool. And so a couple of them took him to a hospital to try to get him help, because he was dead as far as anybody could tell. Cold water drownings, sometimes you can revive the person after a longer period of time, but it wasn't cold water. And it still takes a while for the person to recover. But the other believers were back praying. Well, an hour and a half with Vikram's body, I mean, one doctor said, he's dead, get him out of here. The next doctor tried to revive him, couldn't do anything. So an hour and a half, they're bringing the body back, and suddenly the boy wakes up, and his report is that he heard the name Jesus and then was rescued. His Hindu parents said that he'd never heard that name before, and here they are joining the Christians in their worship service. This one's from Indonesia. A neighbor of mine helped me interview this person. But I have this picture here, particularly to remind me to tell you to close your eyes if you get queasy at the sight of blood, because his friend, Dominguez, as you can see, his neck was clearly cut. The original scene was bloodier. This is after the body's been moved. So if that's not dead, well, anyway, he looks dead to me. And the people who were transporting his body obviously thought he was dead too. But he claims that he had an experience of heaven, was sent back into his body. The doctors did have to sew his neck, so there was medical intervention at that point. But they thought he was dead. They were getting ready to send him to the morgue when he made them know he was alive. So they sewed his neck back, and he uses that as his testimony. I'm going to skip some more. This one is from another scholar that I know. I was sharing some of this at a meeting at SBL where I wasn't sure quite what the reception would be, but they asked me to talk about something that didn't usually get talked about, so I did. Said, maybe the way people in the majority world read some of these stories, we could learn from in the West. Maybe we're too biased by our Humean presuppositions. After I said that, there was, of course, some discussion, but Ayo Adewuya stood up in the back and talked about his son, who was born dead, pronounced dead, and they prayed for half an hour. The son was alive then and now has a master's, and actually now has 2 master's degrees. I could tell you about Leo. Well, just briefly about Leo. He was a friend of mine. We did work together in northern Nigeria. And he was in one non-Christian village where they asked him, some neighbors came and said, please pray for our son. he's dead. And he prayed and handed, for a few hours actually, and then handed the boy back to them alive. I found that out because I was writing this book on miracles, so I asked Leo, have you ever seen any? He said, no, not very many. So he sent me just 7 pages. But Tim Olaniday actually was dead for 8 hours, was in the morgue. God raised him, but I'm going to skip that one for the sake of time. He's also a friend of mine. I'm going to skip this one. And these are examples from the mainline Protestant denomination in Congo, Brazzaville, my wife's country. One of them is from, that's right, the laser doesn't work, was from the then president of the denomination whose son had been raised. But Jean Mabiala gave us 3 accounts of this. One of them actually witnessed by my brother-in-law, and I could give others, but again, for the sake of time, I'm going on to Papa Bisweswe. Now, Papa Bisweswe is not only a friend of the family, he's actually married into the family. His daughter is married to my brother-in-law, so he's my in-law. But Papa Bisweswe was a school inspector in Etumbi in the north of Congo, and they brought him a dead girl. They said, we tried everything else. We tried traditional healers. She'd been dead for about 8 hours now. They brought her to him, last of all, saying, maybe your God can do something. And he was like, you should have come to the true God first. But he took her aside, prayed, handed her back to the family alive, made quite an impression in the village, so that next time a child died, they came looking for Papa Bisweswe. He was out of town, so they settled for his wife and asked her to pray. And so Julienne Bisweswe prayed for that child. She was scared out of her mind, but that child came back to life. I said, you just pray for everybody and once in a while it happens? They said, no, these are the only 2 times. It's just something God did in Etumbi. This is the one that really got my attention, though, and I have to share this one. Because, if you start with really skeptical premises, you'll explain everything away. But if once you realize miracles can happen, then, it lowers the bar a bit, so that if you have good evidence for a miracle, there's good reason to believe it. This is Antoinette Malambe. This is not the most dramatic. It's not 8 hours or a couple days like some of the accounts. But Antoinette Malambe shared with me that when her daughter Therese was 2 years old, her daughter cried out that she was bitten by a snake. Antoinette Malambe got to her, found her not breathing. There was no medical help available in the village, so she strapped the child to her back, ran to a nearby village where a family friend, Coco Ngoma Moise, was doing ministry. And Coco Moise prayed for the child. The child started breathing again. Next day she was fine, no brain damage. In fact, now Therese has a master's degree and is a pastor back in Congo. Well, I asked Antoinette Malambe, how long was it that your daughter wasn't breathing? She had to stop and think to get from one village to the next. She said, about 3 hours. Now, that got my attention because Antoinette Malambe was my mother-in-law. Therese is my sister-in-law. And not that one's mother-in-law, but we did confirm it with Coco Moise. And I could give you a lot more, but unless we're burying too many people prematurely, sometimes, yeah, we misdiagnose death, but unless we're burying too many people prematurely, how often do you think somebody would be a witness to something like this happening? And what are the odds of me having 10 people in my immediate circle who've witnessed this happening? I tried to approximate what the odds would be, and it'd be something like, minimally, the odds would be like 1 in 10 billion. Probably the odds are a lot more than that. So explaining all these as coincidences is not the most probable explanation. A theistic explanation has a lot more going for it in this case. So just briefly, let me tell one nature miracle, and then I need to stop. let me tell you about my colleague, Emanuela Thompson, who was a fellow professor where I used to teach. He grew up in northern Nigeria, where his father was planting churches. They're from the middle belt of Nigeria. They were planting churches in the north in completely unchurched villages. And one place where they were planting a church was, rainy season was starting. And they just moved there, and they didn't have the roof on their home yet. And it was going to take 3 or 4 more days to get the roof on their home. And so people were making fun of them and saying, "Ha, you say your God is powerful, but you're going to lose everything you have. Everything you have is going to be ruined." And the father lost his temper, which is not a recommended Christian practice, but he lost his temper and said, "It's not going to rain 1 drop of rain on this village until I have a roof on my house." I was going to take another 3 days. They just laughed, because you could see the storm clouds on the horizon. But after 3 days or 4 days, I think it was 4 days, yes, 4 days. For 4 days, water fell all around the village, but not a single drop of rain fell in the village. And at the end of those 4 days, there was only one person in that village who had not become a Christian. And to this day, they still speak of that as the precipitating event that brought about the village's conversion. Okay, the pun only works in English, not in Hausa, but still.